So Donald Trump often gets a bad rap because of his disregard for norms, lack of concern for the truth, and his disdain for allies. But Trump may actually be what the world needs right now, and in today's video, I'll be examining to what extent this is true. For a long time, the world has been dominated by the rules-based order. By rules-based, I mean the institutions created by America in the aftermath of World War II. This includes things like the UN, the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the GATT, now World Trade Organization. Okay, such was the system that America championed for well over 80 years. And for a long time, the system worked. Peace and prosperity were genuinely provided if you were middle class and white. Nah, I'm kidding. If you're like middle class, if you're like middle class in most areas of the world, I'd say maybe. But the system was flawed, and the extent to which it was is what I'll be discussing in today's video. In part 1, I'll be going over the history that has led up to this point, and in part 2, I'll be looking more specifically at Trump and the effect he's having on our current world order. Right, we'll start with part 1, Dawn of the Liberal World Order. So, guys, yeah, look, our story begins with Harry Truman declaring his doctrine on the 12th of March 1947. Back then, the Second World War had just ended and the United States was standing toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. Truman vowed to make it the policy of the United States to support the free people of the world. And so he set up these things like the IMF and the World Bank, and through these, he was able to provide loans to less developing countries. Now, there's a catch to these institutions. I'm making an entire video about the darker side of these institutions, and that'll be released in Super Imperialism Part 2, okay, 1944 to 1971, okay. This video is generally like a much more optimistic take on America and the role it's played in the world. Not without question, but generally a little bit more optimistic. That one is a much more cynical look at the darker aspects of the liberal world project, especially, and it really focuses on the financial and economic side of things. So yeah, guys, when that comes out, do give it a watch, okay? I can't wait for that one, because I'm not gonna lie, I love this video. As things stand, I'm feeling good, I'm having a good time making it, but that video which will come out, that one's gonna be really good, okay? So keep your eyes peeled for that one. Look, for the most part, I think these institutions, yes, that America was self-interested when it created them, but they did genuinely help a lot of people, and I'll be going into how much they helped the world later on in this video. Institutions like the UN set the precedent for what was and was no longer permissible. All countries, regardless of size and power, were able to determine their own sovereignty, even if this was just on paper, even if America would then just prevent them from doing this later on. On paper, a lot of countries, medium-sized and small-sized countries, were given the right to self-determination and to have their sovereignty preserved, and that was huge, okay? Because before World War II, it was very much survival of the fittest, kind of like what we're heading into again now. Don't know why I'm laughing at this. This isn't funny, but you know, if you don't laugh, you'll cry, right? The stage was set for the most remarkable period of history. The question was whether America could uphold these rules, these norms, and these values, right? So we're going to dive into part 2, the Cold War. And yeah, look, the Cold War is like, it doesn't start instantly. For like a couple years, America and the Soviets try and iron out their differences. Truman talks to Stalin and so on, but they can't resolve their differences. These are now two huge powers, both interested in imperialist practices and conquering places in some form or another, I would say. And they can't see eye to eye, and their first crisis comes over Berlin when Stalin tries to block the Western Europeans and the Americans out of Berlin, and then Truman and his boys get together and offer aid through an airlift and basically save the Berliners from being trapped under Stalin's tyranny. Truman essentially saves 2 million Berliners, okay? You know, as someone who is pro-liberty, pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, I would say he did quite a good thing here, okay? He delivered them food, coal, medicine, every 30 seconds. At his peak, every 30 seconds, this guy was delivering them stuff. So the liberal world order actually gets off to a pretty good start, okay? Stalin was humiliated, but he was eager for a punch back, so in 1950, comes at Truman he comes after South Vietnam, but by going after South Vietnam, he's coming after America, right? Look, guys, just to be clear, I look at the world from great power politics perspective, okay? I think great powers basically influence and shape the world. I'm kind of a realist, okay? I'm a liberal realist if there was ever such a thing, but yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it's great powers that really shape the world. When push comes to shove, it's them. And so what happens is America and the Soviets have their first conflict in Korea, right? South Korea wanted to be democratic, North Korea wanted to take the peninsula and bring it under communist dictatorship. The North are backed by Stalin and Chinese ruler Chairman Mao. And Zhao Enlai, man. Wait until you see my Nixon epic with Zhao. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, man, but Zhao Enlai is the guy, man. Zhao Enlai, you don't mess with Zhao Enlai, man. Look, at first it looks like it's going to go North Korea's way, but then Truman sends in General Douglas MacArthur, and then the South Koreans push the North Koreans all the way back to like the 35th parallel, I think it's called, and they start winning. And then MacArthur's like, yeah, like, Truman, give me some nukes, I'm going to go after China. And Truman's like, what are you doing? We don't want to start a war with China. But before MacArthur can even do that, freaking Zhao Enlai sends some men in and stops the Americans from pushing the North Koreans any further back, man. And then Stalin sends some, sends his Air Force in, and they start bombing some people as well. It makes, like, everyone says, oh, the Cold War, there was no real fighting between America and the Soviets. Nonsense, man. There was, like, indirect fighting between the Americans and the Chinese and the Soviets. And then there was loads of fighting between the Chinese and the Soviets as well, like, more the political, like, they didn't get along. Like, it's kind of like, who's really ruler of the communist world, kind of thing going on there. The Korean War ends in a draw. The South secure their land, but the North remain in their area as well. America saw this as a point gained rather than a point lost. You have to understand that they secured the South Korean market, and they also set up a base outside of China. It would lay the foundation for the 700 to 800 bases America had throughout the world, and this would prove useful in the larger battle against communism. In 1953, Truman steps down and America ushers in the era of Eisenhower. One of Eisenhower's first acts is to help the United Kingdom topple Iran's leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. It's here that America's commitments to its ideals and the liberal world order becomes questioned, right? Now, whether this act is in fact a breach of the liberal world order is a hotly contested topic. On the one hand, America overthrew this democratically elected leader. Mossadegh was democratically elected, and a breath of fresh air after the years of autocracy Iran had had. But on the other hand, America was also toppling a man who was threatening to nationalize the British-owned oil fields. And this is an act that challenged the property rights of the British owners. Now, this challenges liberalism. Within liberalism is the central tenet of respecting one another's property rights. I mean, it's a foundation of the liberal world order. It doesn't matter whether it's a British person's business in another country. A fundamental pillar of liberalism is you respect property rights regardless of who they belong to. And to have let Mossadegh take those oil fields without any repercussions would have set a dangerous precedent. You know, if America lets one country seize property, then how many other countries might start getting ideas and start doing it as well? America's practice of prioritizing the property interests of its elites at the expense of foreigners became a recurring theme during Eisenhower's time. In 1954, he overthrew the democratically elected leader of Guatemala, Jacob Arbenz. Arbenz was rallying against the US company United Fruit and was threatening to take from it the land they had bought in Guatemala. The company was using this land for farming bananas which it then imported to the United States. Eisenhower launched a coup with the Dallas brothers. Yeah, he launched a coup against the Guatemalan leader and replaced him with a ruthless dictator who would do America's bidding. And again, this becomes a common thing during the Cold War where America will happily sacrifice the democracy of another country if it means putting in a leader that's more sympathetic to their interests. And this is one of the, hypocrisies of a liberal world order. You talk about democracy, but it's almost like it's the capital aspect of the American global project kind of trump the democratic side of it. And when push comes to shove and America needs to pursue its own interests, understandably so, by the way, they will choose the business interests of their elite. I mean, the more you read, the more it becomes apparent that what truly matters is the preservation of property rights and the accessibility of foreign markets. Again, I'll go into how important America's access to foreign markets were in my Super Imperialism Part 2 video, okay? But for the time being, let's come back to the liberal world order, which is the main theme of this video. It's during the 50s and 60s that America directs its liberal world institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to avoid investing in foreign entities that could compete with the United States, right? So here are these global institutions that have everyone's best interests at heart, and yet America's directing them to only help countries that won't really pose a threat to American industry. Such is the case with Latin America, whose desire for investment in areas like agriculture was turned down because America didn't want a competitor in the area of agriculture. This system looked compromised, but wasn't yet dead, okay? So in 1960, Eisenhower stepped down, and America saw rejuvenation with the charismatic young Democrat JFK. Kennedy was a godsend for the liberal world order. You know, this guy was smooth, he was slick, he was good looking, he came from a wealthy background. He just looked good, didn't he? Like Kennedy, when he spoke, and he was a great orator as well, you know, so when he speaks, you just want to listen, right? I mean, if I was around in the 60s, I would have loved Kennedy, honestly. Like Truman, Kennedy vowed to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. But Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 and was replaced by Lyndon B. Johnson, who ardently fought to uphold his legacy. While the invasion of Vietnam had begun with Kennedy, Johnson escalated the conflict further and destroyed reputations, both of his own and of his country's in the process. The country also entered financial difficulty during this time. The Korean War had started a trend towards fighting wars by issuing bonds rather than, relying on taxpayers or anything. And then the Vietnam War takes this to new heights. Vietnam sends America's deficit spiraling out of control. And what I mean by that is during the Vietnam War, America starts importing like crazy just to kind of sustain its economy. It basically takes all its funds, whatever it has, to spend on the war, and because it's spending so much on the war, it has to import lots of other foreign products and stuff. European countries begin losing their faith in America and begin exchanging their dollars for gold. And Johnson starts to freak out, as does Nixon later on, and they come up with these schemes. So Johnson, it's like the scheme Johnson comes up with is like an e-commerce store today offering you a coupon instead of your money back. Instead of taking out gold, Johnson encourages the Europeans to invest their dollars in the US, in US Treasury IOUs. Okay, that way when America grows, the Europeans would keep making money back on interest. And the Europeans give in to this, basically. This would also spark one of the greatest economic masterstrokes of the 20th century. Again, I'll be discussing that in Super Imperialism Part 2. Nixon comes to power in 69. Johnson's had enough. Nixon comes to power, and he knew that America's kind of supremacy depended on his ability to end the war in Vietnam. The debt was growing larger by the day, and alongside his eminent national security advisor Henry Kissinger, Nixon turned a blind eye to the Europeans and instead opted for great power bargains with the Soviets and Chinese. I feel like the liberal world order project takes a backseat during the Nixon years and maybe during the Ford years as well. It's not really it doesn't seem like as much a part. It's not like abandoned or like jeopardized in the way that Trump is jeopardizing it today. But I mean, with Nixon, the priority really was the national interest rather than any commitment to maintaining or upholding democracy. I think that the event that epitomizes this most significantly is Nixon's abandonment of Vietnam, okay? Nixon knew he couldn't win Vietnam, okay? So he abandons it. He comes up with a deal with the Vietnamese and the Chinese to not take it instantly so that it doesn't look bad and that he can win re-election. But within a couple years, the North Vietnamese run over the South Vietnamese, and Nixon doesn't do anything. He doesn't go that extra step to try and uphold the democracy that his predecessors vowed to uphold. And this kind of ties into the realism of the time. America had been hit hard by Vietnam. It had lost out a lot, and I think it just wanted a temporary period of retrenchment where it kind of focused on other things, boosting its economy again and so on before it went in again. And it would go in again during the late 70s and 80s when Carter and then Reagan comes in. Just to clarify, the 70s was a really rough decade for America. You have the oil embargo, you have New York starting to go into decay and stuff. But America does come back, and I think no one epitomizes the comeback more so than Ronald Reagan, who, along with Margaret Thatcher, spearheads the neoliberal era. Okay, this is an era of free markets, free flows of goods, okay, where capitalism is given like an injection, low taxes, and so on. I'll put, like, to be honest, the neoliberal era deserves its own video, and I'll happily make a video on that. There's a guy called Ben Norton on Geopolitical Economy Report. He's done a great video on the neoliberal era. Politically, I'm a bit more like center right. I think he's quite left, but I really rate him as a content creator. If you ever want like really solid content backed up with really great statistics and evidence, honestly, check out Ben Norton on Geopolitical Economy Report. The guy's great. Look, I'm going to jump to the late 80s when the Soviet Union collapses, because I do want to move on and look at Trump, okay? Like, the video was called Trump, and I haven't really discussed Trump yet, but this history does matter, okay? It's really important, and I need to start producing longer videos, okay? so that's kind of it too. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1989, America came to believe that it had won not only because of communism's flaw, but because of the superiority of the neoliberal system. Okay, the system was spread hesitantly at first, but then more enthusiastically when Bill Clinton comes into office. In 2000, at the end of his term, he invites China into the World Trade Organization, and, you know, for like a good, like, just under 10 years, we really did live in this Fukuyama fairy tale where it did look like history had actually ended. You know, wars were a thing of the past. There was very little for anyone to do other than kind of just work hard and make money. And for I think a lot of liberals like Fukuyama and Fareed Zakaria and so on, that really was it. I mean, there was nothing to fight over anymore. You just trade, be tolerant, and we can all get along and like make positive sum gains, right? Get gains, right? Now, Fareed Zakaria and Francis Fukuyama were both students of Samuel Huntington, who comes out with an alternative book called The Clash of Civilizations, which I think, not entirely by the way, it's got a lot of mistakes in it, but and it's a very simplistic view of the world. Like, the world doesn't really work like that, but I think it foreshadowed a lot of the things we are seeing today, and I think in some ways it got the future, our current era, like the 2020s. Huntington was much more spot on in terms of what would happen than Fukuyama and Zakaria were. I think Fukuyama and Zakaria were much better for the 90s and maybe 2000s. Huntington kind of almost foresaw what's happening today, which is crazy. This takes us quite nicely into the next part of this video, okay, which is on the rise and fall of the unipolar moment. I think you could say the fall. So I think most people would say it began with 2008. Went a step forward in 2016 and officially ended in 2024 with Trump's re-election. I'm going to start in 2001 with 9/11. If you haven't seen my video on what is geopolitics, do go check it out. Yeah, 9/11 is a very personal thing for me. I wasn't there in New York, but I was alive. I was very young, and I remember exactly where I was when it happened. And I remember it because 9/11 had a very big impact on me, being a Middle Easterner in the West. Like, look, neoliberalism didn't start to fall with 9/11. I think 9/11 was a bit of a disruption to the system. It showed America that there were Islamist extremists out there who didn't want to buy into this whole neoliberal project, that these people were very comfortable adhering to their own faiths and not giving in to Western imperialism, as they called it. From 2001 to 2008, 2001 to 2016, I don't think you'd find anyone who would dispute America's position as the global hegemon. But 9/11 started something, okay? It started something that would eventually reveal the limits of US power, which is why I'm bringing it up now. When it happens, Bush sends soldiers into Afghanistan. Okay, and at the time this seemed like a no-nonsense decision, right? The region's leaders were thought to be harboring members of Al-Qaeda, the group that planned and executed the 9/11 attacks. It made sense to go after them. But just as happened during the 50s and 60s, America began pursuing its interest regardless of the international rules stipulated by the UN Charter. In 2003, it attacks Iraq on the basis that the country's leader, Saddam Hussein, was harboring weapons of mass destruction. The mission was the first in a series of invasions that saw US President George Bush and his team of neoconservatives. Do you remember is anyone like around my age who remembers these guys, like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, man, these guys like so ruthless, man. I saw the film on Cheney called Vice. I was a bit disappointed, but yeah, man, I remember these guys, man. It takes me back to my childhood, man. These like neocons are like properly like about spreading. They're like modern day crusaders in a political sense. Like the neocons were adamant about spreading the liberal world order, okay? They wanted it. They were going into places like Iraq and Afghanistan saying like, yeah, just give us time. Within a few years, they'll be reading the New York Times. And that's a genuine quote from one of them. I'm not sure which one of them it's from, but it's a genuine quote from one of them. And you know what? I'm not even going to go in too hard on the neoconservatives, because the thing is, right, you got to bear in mind that America had brought liberal democracy to places like Japan and South Korea. Japan and South Korea are totally different cultures to America. So I think a lot of them thought, okay, well, if it can work there, it can work anywhere, right? The problem was, I don't think these people understood the Middle East. Like, have you ever been to the Middle East? I love the Middle East. I'm Middle Eastern myself, but like a lot of these people, man, you don't want to give them democracy. they don't care, man. They've got their own way of doing things, and it's very deeply entrenched there. And I think they just overlooked that, or they didn't care and they just wanted to, you know, force a market. Over the course of the next 20 years, one Middle Eastern dictator fell after another. Saddam, Gaddafi, Mubarak, Assad. Such were the victims of the liberal world project. Now, many will argue for their justified removal. The liberal world was against, you know, discrimination. It was against autocratic regimes and so on. But the thing is, in enforcing it, its adherents ended up discriminating against others, you know? It's like, oh, how dare you not be free? It's like, you know, it's almost like a bit ironic, okay? And it goes back, I'm just taking a little break here because I want to stress how grateful I am to be a Westerner, how grateful I am to be living in a liberal democracy. There's no system I would choose over that. But the problem with liberal democracy is, for people who have only ever known it, without really ever spending time in another country, they become convinced that they're the good guys. Okay, we have liberal democracy, we are tolerant, we must be the good guys. And don't get me wrong, it's the best system I know, but you're not necessarily the good guys. I think a lot of people who have never truly explored other cultures or been part of other cultures may fall into the trap of thinking that. And don't get me wrong, I do believe in good and evil. I just don't really believe in good and evil on a political sense. Look, I'll have to elaborate on that in another video. Look, there's a great quote by Samuel Huntington of all people about this. He says, "The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do." And it's so true. I'm so impressed that someone like Huntington could come to such an insight. Countries like Russia and Iran couldn't bring themselves to subscribe to an order that claimed to be universal but had then let them down in their times of need. I haven't yet mentioned the mess that happened in Russia during the 90s. They tried this democratic thing, it didn't work. And obviously Iran, we discussed earlier in this video. Nations like China began developing economically without necessarily embracing every tenet of the liberal democratic philosophy. The system suffered a huge shock during the financial crisis of 2008 and then came under additional scrutiny during the 2010s because of its disregard for nationalism, its disdain for borders, and its association with identity politics and the woke mind virus. Such were the conditions that led to the rise of Brexit and Trump. When asked in recent interviews whether they'd seen the disruption to the liberal world order coming, neither Francis Fukuyama nor Fareed Zakaria claimed that they had seen where the threat was coming from. Neither could believe that it would come from the United States itself. And this leads me perfectly onto the final section of this video, which is on Trump and the challenge he now poses to the liberal world order. So Trump first ran in 2016 with the intention of shaking up the system. I covered this really well in my video on why he won, so do go check that out. During his initial run, he caused a stir by rallying against the norms we've lived by for well over 30 years. Through its association with the illegal, immigration was no longer perceived as beneficial. Tariffs, once deemed an impediment, were considered a tool vital for the destruction of the neoliberal enterprise. "We're going to drain the swamp," he said. "We're going to drain the swamp." Now, Trump's attempts to dismantle the liberal world order the first time round, like renegotiating things like NAFTA and so on, and removing himself from things like the JCPOA, things like the net zero target and so on, the Paris peace climate, all of these things, you were gradual retrenchments from the liberal world order. But he was also challenged, okay? He didn't come in with his own team, and people like Pompeo, people like John Bolton would definitely challenge Trump, would shackle him to the system that they had grown up and adhered to. This is why I think Trump really struggled to dismantle the project during his first term. His administration was ended by an ailing Joe Biden, who sought to replenish much of what Trump had attacked. Not entirely, by the way, because Biden kept up some of Trump's policies, especially in regard to China. But in other areas, Biden was trying to rebuild what Trump had destroyed. But Trump would return, and he would do so with a new group of people who would help him bring down the curtain on the neoliberal empire. Shortly after taking power on the 20th of January 2025, Trump imposed a series of orders that took the blowtorch to the system, or the hammer. If I'm ever to picture Trump, he really is like a Viking destroying this system, okay? The question is he a breaker of change or is he a destroyer of worlds? On his very first day in office, he withdrew from the Paris Peace Accords to the cheer of 20,000 fans that had gathered to watch him in a local sports arena. On his 19th day in charge, Trump reduced the number of USAID staff from over 10,000 to 611. I think that's actually been the most significant blow to the liberal world project so far. You can't maintain all the NGOs and all the aid without the staff. I think that was definitely going to be one of the nails in the coffin should this thing fall apart completely. The funding was frozen on, and UN aid estimated that if schemes like PEPFAR were removed, there would be a 400% rise in the number of AIDS deaths in South Africa, 6.3 million people between 2025 and 2029. Now, many will point to the US's need to uphold the rules-based system, but others will draw attention to the underwhelming reality facing the United States. America no longer stands head and shoulders above the rest and possesses a smaller share of global GDP than it did 80 years ago. One could almost see the post-war order as a form of welfare state for the global society. This would arguably be aligning my own thinking with Trump. And again, I want to say that I don't entirely agree with him. I don't think the rules-based liberal world order was a way of smaller to medium-sized nations just sponging off the United States. Maybe there was like a small element of that, but really I think the United States was getting as much from this enterprise, this global enterprise, as the rest of the world was. If not, I think the US got more out of it than the rest of the world did, if I'm thinking holistically now. And by America, I really do mean it's kind of the richer Americans. But the thing is, America's ability to sustain it legitimately and financially have both come into question. No country outside of America or Europe really looks at these people as saviors or people worthy of looking up to, not from a moralistic or humanistic standpoint. And again, Europe's economy has contracted. Europe's economy is half of what a lot of researchers believed it would become by 2024. I think in the 90s there were people trying to predict what Europe's economy, what percentage of global GDP Europe would have in 2024 or 2025. They thought it would have maybe about, I think, 15 to 20%, and today it's got like half of that. So, and same with Japan. Do you remember the 80s? I wasn't alive during the 80s, but does anyone remember in the 80s when everyone's like so hyped about Japan? Like Japan was just coming up and up and up and up. It was all that tech it was making, man, and the chips it was making, and everyone's like looking over their shoulder like, oh God, Japan, you got to look out for Japan. And all the Japanese people getting really cocky and stuff. And then in like early to mid 90s, it suddenly just collapses and like stops growing. And now Japan is kind of like Europe. It's got like a aging population with very little prospects. As Trump would say, it's so sad. It's so sad. That's a great question to check out is how come America carried on growing, but Europe and Japan stagnated? I'd love to cover that at some point. Projects like Doge actually excite me, by the way. When I first heard about Doge, I was so hyped. The problem is, now that I've looked into Doge a little bit, everyone's skeptical of Musk's ability to actually make the 2 trillion target cut he wants. He's cut like a quarter of staff, and apparently that's not even going to impact the deficit all that much. So far, all the cuts he's made has taken, apparently, according to one person, like 0.1% of what he needs to do. And that's bearing in mind that he's cut a quarter of the staff he wanted to cut. Look, I'm not saying it's impossible. Maybe Elon Musk knows something about AI and how helpful that's going to be that we don't, okay? The other thing being heavily criticized is Trump's tariffs, okay? Every publication, every YouTube channel, every podcast I listen to is critical of Trump's tariffs, okay? It doesn't look like it's gonna work. All the economists I listen to say it's gonna just make everything more expensive and leave everyone poorer. And I don't yet know what the upside of that is. I'm hoping Trump's tariffs are like a short-term thing. I hope like they're like a short-term strategy. He's just using them in the bargaining, and then eventually when he gets what he wants, whatever that is, he drops them. But if he's trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the US, then it could be a while before the United States economy picks up again. Let's come back to the liberal world order, because this video has been going on for a while now. I want to finish by just looking at some final things, okay? Should Trump abandon the liberal world order? Because as things stand, he hasn't... Like, there are people scared that he'll dissolve NATO and so on. He's not a fan of the EU. He doesn't predict... if Bush didn't listen to the UN, then Trump definitely won't listen to the UN. And he's more 19th century. He's talking about, like, taking territories around him in the Atlantic area, like Greenland and, you know, Panama and Canada. And by doing that, you're definitely not a supporter of the liberal world order, because you don't respect those countries' rights to sovereignty at all. Yes, I embrace realism, but does that mean we should abandon the liberal world order? I'm not saying everything Trump's done is bad, by the way. I think like so it's given Europe a kick up the backside, and long term I'm quite fearful for America, and I'll tell you why. Look at Russia and China right now. These two are close, okay? Now yes, Russia will have its problems with China, and maybe there is room for America and Russia to work together on certain areas, but right now you have China, who has 80 to 90% of the rare earth minerals in the world. Okay, so if you want to make chips, which by the way I believe is like chips are to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th. They are the world's most important resource, and China has 80 to 90% of the material for that. You then consider how they're teaming up with Russia, one of the world's biggest exporters of natural gas and oil and so on. That's a powerhouse like no other. And then you combine that with China's plans and its Belt and Road Initiative and so on. I don't see how America can compete. America has a very small amount of exceptional people. That's where it's really good at. And it's still like the global innovator, isn't it? So when it comes to designing AI and stuff, yeah, for sure. But China's proving that it can do that stuff too. Oh mate, we're living in such interesting times, man. And when you watch Trump, it's like a show. Like one day this is happening, the next day that's happening. It's like reality TV, and I'm like, is this just to distract Americans from what's really going on in the world? I don't know. Sometimes that's just what I think. Let's conclude, guys, because this video has been going on for quite a while. When America began its liberal world project, it was their hope that the system would bring about greater peace and prosperity. Liberals will definitely contend that it did, and I'm in their camp on this one. I think it did bring greater prosperity to a lot of the world, and I'm willing to bet. Okay, I've only read like a book on this, but I'm willing to bet that the people who constructed this system had this genuine belief that it could eventually help us avoid catastrophes like the Second World War. When the Cold War ended in 1989, it felt like we well and truly had achieved this. We had reached the end of history. But it looks like the West overestimated the appeal of its system and underestimated the cultures and the wishes of the people they enforced it on. Donald Trump's rise is a reaction to the neoliberal project. It's an outlet for those that feel dissatisfied with him. As someone whose parents ran away from autocracy and came to the United Kingdom in search of a better life, I find myself conflicted. On the one hand, liberal democracy is what made countries like Great Britain and the United States the good guys. I know I ripped into this earlier on, but liberal democracy does in some ways make the UK and the US the good guys. It's the system I think most people would rather live in. And a lot of people will attack me for that, be like, no, those people are just as good. Like, nah, man, would you really want to go live in North Korea? Be my guest, man. And yet there's this other side to me that's thinking, no, that whole good guy, bad guy narrative is rubbish. I remember the Bush and Blair years when these guys lied and then used their power to go and just dump all over the Middle Easterners and stuff. The reason I went for Trump in 2024 is because he seemed like the candidate who would end America's obsession with the forever wars. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine. These wars need to end, man. They need to end, because America doesn't even win them. America just goes in, has like a good start, then starts losing money, then starts losing men, and before you know it, it's bogged down, it leaves the region, and the region becomes autocratic or led by a dictator anyway. It's a really bad record. How is no one talking about this record? Like, don't get me wrong, I love America, like, in so many ways. Like, no country has brainwashed me as effectively as the United States. I love American food, I love American movies, American music, okay? I'm such a sucker for America in so many ways, okay? Whenever I listen to Razorlight, America, part of me wants to cry, okay? Part of me wants to cry. But come on, guys, you gotta, like, if you're gonna go to war, try and win one. Can't even win anything. You spend trillions of dollars on like people like a fraction of your power, and you still can't win. It's unbelievable, man. Like China, meanwhile, spends trillions on a Belt and Road Initiative, which is going to make it trillions more. Trump allegedly stands for ending the forever wars and returning the United States to a country focused on business and innovation. And if this is what Trump truly does, then I will sing his praises. But already there are alarm bells ringing. Okay, so Trump's pick for National Security Advisor and Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense are all very hawkish on China and Iran. And again, I feel like your default almost has to be hawkish if you're working in in the US politics. It's just whether Trump will commit to this less interventionist policy. I mean, look, you have people like John Bolton saying he can't, okay, that the US needs to be involved, because if the US isn't, this is the thing, US used to love being isolationist. Before World War II, it loved being isolationist. Pearl Harbor really disturbed America. It kind of, and you know, that's a time when America was also looking to expand into foreign markets and stuff because its industry had grown so strong. So 1944-45 is a real turning point in US history because they suddenly become more interventionist. And they realize that their lifeblood is attached to the world, and that they become more prosperous when they work with the rest of the world. And Trump seems to be the very first departure from that. Not entirely. I don't think he's entirely isolationist at all. I think he's got his own brand of something, and I'm still trying to figure out what that is exactly. He's going to remain involved in those places which are directly attached to the national interest. I just don't think he's going to care very much for places like Ukraine, where he doesn't see a direct profit to be made or to gain anything from it in the short term. I think Trump is more realist than he is liberal. I'd be willing to bet that. I think he believes in spheres of influence, and I think he's willing to let Putin have Ukraine, because Ukraine is to Russia what, you know, Cuba is to America, what Wales would be to Britain or something. Okay, I think these bigger countries look at those countries as their spheres, which is tragic, but then that is the tragedy of great power politics. Go check out John Mearsheimer's book if you haven't. I believe that the world is experiencing a return to history, and I believe we're seeing the return of spheres of influence. I think great powers compete. I think that's just the world we live in. My concern, though, revolves around how deeply entrenched we get into this realist way of living. Because obviously, realism taken to an extreme is just non-stop war. And, you know, that's not a kind of world I want to live in either. Which is why, like I say, like, if I had to be something, I'm either a liberal realist or a realistic liberal. Like, I'm somewhere in between. I think, you know, there's a time and place to pursue both, isn't there? Can America compete with countries like China and Iran without it spilling over into World War III? If Trump is to dissolve the liberal world order, well then can countries remain responsible for performing the kind of balancing act that we haven't seen since the 19th century? History says no. We've tried balancing acts before. Bismarck most famously did it during the 19th century. And whilst he actually did it very well, he and various others balanced one another without fighting for a long, long time. This system, this way of doing things did eventually break down with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914. And this is the thing, so like when Trump won, there was a part of me that got quite excited because it was something new. We're entering a brave new world and so on. But then I think, you know what? The liberal world order system that I grew up with is probably going to be the best system I'd ever lived through. I think I'm waffling now. But it generated more peace and prosperity than any period before, man. Cold War and the post-Cold War era, neoliberal era I call it, generally peaceful eras, okay? I think we may be departing from that now. This is the thing, Trump's dissolved USAID. Okay, and yes, there's a lot of like selling weapons within that and so on, but it also played a part in making the world a better place and curing things like AIDS and stuff. These things made for a less turbulent world, and you know, when you do things like Doge, you're just cutting them open, aren't you? Just tearing them apart. Is Trump the right person right now? I think the world needs a bit of a shake-up. The question is, how much of a shake-up are we willing to endure, and how bad is it going to get? Guys, many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this World Order show, then do hit the like button and subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics, economics, and industry. You are currently watching the World Order show, which is my most casual series. I have 2 other playlists. I do the World Order in red labels, which are informative, factual stories, really great. Go check those out. And I also do the World Order saga, or the World Order cinematics, where I take global figures and retell their stories as epic works of action, adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, and opera. It is ultimately my dream. The whole reason I started this channel was to give you the same feeling I had when I was a 7-year-old boy watching Star Wars for the first time, and through the black labels, that's what I'm trying to do. It's what I'm trying to achieve. Okay, so do go check those out, guys. If you've enjoyed this, do give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the bell icon, stay up to date with all new World Order content. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.